All right. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'm here representing the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, and I'm pleased to have you all join us. Tonight, we have Tom Jerow presenting a presentation on the Bonifas Story, an immigrant's rag to riches logging era story. Tom is a member of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. He currently sits on the board of directors, and he's retired from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He keeps himself pretty busy working at a food pantry garden, working on genealogy of his extensive family, and volunteering as the city forester for Rhinelander. Tonight, the talk is about one of his family members, and specifically the Boniface family. 8 Bonifas siblings moved or immigrated from Luxembourg to the Garden Peninsula in Upper Michigan. They began working in lumber camps and slowly worked their way up to owning and operating one of the largest lumber operations in the Upper Peninsula. We'll spend some time tonight looking at the foray into Wisconsin, where they owned and operated the Vilas County Lumber Company and the mill in Presque Isle, Wisconsin. Just a couple housekeeping issues before we turn this over to Tom. If you experience any difficulties during the webinar, just enter into the comments, whatever the problem is, and I will see what we can do to fix that. And then that same chat feature will be used for sharing questions that we'll give to our speaker at the end of tonight's presentation. Feel free to enter those questions at any time. And with that, I'm pleased to turn this over to Tom and have him tell us about the William Boniface family.
Okay, thank you. Lo and behold, my computer had a little glitch here and I had to reopen the document. It should be up here in a minute. I'm not sure what went wrong, but it's the wonders of technology. We should be back on screen, right, Don?
Yes.
All right. So as I mentioned, William Boniface was my great uncle, and it's quite the story. And I suppose it's kind of odd, but we're going to start at the end when he died in 1934 at the age of 71 years old. And he had amassed a fortune that was estimated at that time at $25 million. And I think that's actually quite a bit on the low side. I've done a fair amount of research on the estate, and it's probably on the low side, which, in 1936, right after the Depression, it was pretty amazing that someone had that kind of wealth piled up. So the Boniface family started arriving in 1881. And William Boniface, who was kind of the leader of the organization, came in 1884. He joined his brothers, and they cut pine and cedar around Garden, Michigan. And then they came from Luxembourg, and in the 1890s, their parents passed away. And so the rest of the sisters came to the United States to join the rest of the family, like I said, was in Garden. And I have to correct right away, I had a little error in the material for this program. There were 7 brothers and sisters. There probably were 8, as in a lot of families, some infants died. So here's the a part of the cast of characters. So William Boniface is up in the left-hand corner here of the slide. Again, he was the main shaker and mover. His wife was Catherine Nolan, and she was of Irish descent. James Boniface here was a prominent role in the Boniface brother operation. Isaac Boniface was almost as wealthy as William Boniface. They were more or less partners. This is Kate Boniface down here. My Aunt Kate. This is the only Boniface that I knew in person. The rest of them all had passed away before I was born. But I knew my Aunt Kate, and she was quite an interesting character. This is her husband, Dick Shire. He procured the horses for the Boniface operation. And so he was always obtaining more draft horses for the operation. And the next two people here are my grandparents, Cecilia Boniface, who was William Boniface's sister, younger sister. When she came to the United States, she was only 6 years old, an orphan. As I said, her parents had died. And then this is my dad, or my grandfather, Frank Jerow. So that's kind of the list of characters. We'll be seeing them throughout the webinar here. And I thought we'd start off just with a little introduction. So this isn't William Boniface, but this is how he got his start. He came to the United States, got on a train, as I said, went to Escanaba, Michigan, and got in the Garden Peninsula where his maternal uncle was. And he had a large tract of land that had cedar on it. And so he started cutting railroad ties with a broad axe, and it was piecework. So he made something like 10 cents a tie. And supposedly he was quite good at it. And he earned enough money to buy a logging horse and start off his logging enterprise. And that's how he began, like I said, cutting railroad ties. A lot of mature cedar on the Garden Peninsula, which, as many of you may know, cedar was prized for railroad tie making because it lasted a long time. So here's the Garden Peninsula. Over on this side of the slide is Escanaba. Down here is on the lower part would be Marinette. The Garden Peninsula comes down and it almost connects to the Dore Peninsula. So that's just kind of giving you a feel where you're at. So here is their maternal uncle's farm, the Boniface farm. And they started logging up in the interior of the UP and driving logs down to Lake Michigan. And they most likely dealt with the Badenoch Lumber Company. The Sturgeon River comes down through here to Nama, Michigan. And the Badenoch Company was a large operation. So they did river drives down to the Badenoch. And then after a while, after, operating some camps and building up some equity, they were able to purchase two mills, the little river mill here, and then the little harbor mill. Both were large mills. They weren't little, but they just happened to be on things that were little. The farms all played a prominent role in the Boniface logging operations throughout the time, because you needed hay and grain for the animals, and you needed potatoes and vegetables for the loggers. And so as they moved west across the UP, these farms played a prominent role in feeding those lumberjacks and the logging operations, including the horses. I don't really know if they ever used oxen. Early in the logging era, a lot of people used oxen because they were a little bit more sturdy than the horses. But for the most part, as far as I know, handed down from family, they were mainly used draft horses for their logging operations. So this is the Badenoch Lumber Company in Nama, Michigan, quite a large operation. And my grandfather, who was in the lower right-hand corner here, Frank Jerow, was the company clerk there. So he kept the books for Badenoch, and a lot of the lumber would have been delivered, through river drives down to Badenoch. So as I said, my grandmother was 6 years old, and here she is at the one-room schoolhouse in Garden, Michigan. You can see her circled there and her name down here underlined. She was educated here, which was a blessing to the family because none of the boys went to school ever. Peter, James, and Isaac and John Boniface, none of them had any formal education. And in fact, William Boniface signed his name with an X for almost his whole life, even after amassing millions of dollars. And we'll get into more of that later. So my grandmother was actually vice president of Boniface Brothers Lumber Company because she was able to do the books and so forth. And so they, like I said, this little harbor mill on the east side of the Garden Peninsula was one of their first forays into owning a company town and operating a company mill. Came with all the trappings, a company store, buildings rented out to workers, all of that good stuff, and we'll see some of that. But if you're wondering how my grandparents met, she was the company clerk for Little Harbor, and of course my grandfather was the company clerk for Badenoch. So they actually got married quite late. They were in their 30s. So excuse me, I got a little frog here. All right, so I already mentioned the importance the farms played, and I guess they were all operated by family members, either extended family members or family members. And, you know, they brought and hauled both food for the horses and the food for the lumberjacks, mainly potatoes. The farm at Garden, Michigan, if you can remember back to the picture, produced all the beef for the operations. And William Boniface was always quite proud of the beef that he served at his lumber camps. It was one of the major ways you attracted lumberjacks was by having good food. So this is a picture from the farm at Isabella where they had a thrashing crew put together. So this was not, this was hard work, and it took a lot of people to run a thrasher. And again, the grain would have been sent off to fuel a lot of the logging horses that we'll see later in the presentation. One of my favorite pictures of the farmhouse in Garden. This place was always very special to my aunt and uncle. It was like home sweet home. So this in the middle here is Catherine Boniface. And I also wanted to introduce this person on the right because she played a prominent role in the corporation. Her name was Mary Hogan, and she came to the Garden Peninsula to be a school teacher, and she boarded with the Boniface family because they had no children and they had the extra room, and so she boarded with the family, and she continued to live with the family throughout the logging enterprise. But I love this picture. It just kind of a neat old time picture. And then this is the farmhouse in Garden. They own this house their entire life, and they always return to it. Like I said earlier, it was home sweet home. So in the 1900s, they started, later in the 1900s, towards 1910, they started buying hardwood. The pine had, of course, exhausted by 1900. And so they moved east to Watersmeet in Marinesco, Michigan, and they started buying hardwood lands and thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of hardwood. They had saved money, and Boniface always poured the profits from the previous year into purchasing land because that was what fueled the operation. Little note here about James Boniface in the picture here. He went with the family to Watersmeet. Just north of Watersmeet was a town called Boniface, Michigan. Population 200, as the note says there. But he immediately caught typhoid fever, and they sent him back by train to Escanaba but he died. And ever since that period, Boniface always had a doctor on staff at his lumber camps or his mills, usually at the mill town, but they were always available. And he paid attention to employee health because he knew it was important. And again, his brother died from typhoid fever. So this is the little town of Boniface on Bass Lake in Watersmeet Township in Dogebik County. So just for those who might want to know where we're at, just a mile south of Bass Lake is the casino at Watersmeet, operated by the Ojibwa people there. They were, the Native Americans were always important people to the Boniface family, and they were often employed in their lumber camps, and they had a close relationship. Even from when they lived on the Garden Peninsula, there was Ojibwa people there too. So as I introduced these two before, Kate and Dick Shire. Kate was a Boniface girl. Dick was from Ireland also. And he was the horse buyer. And he purchased all the draft horses for the organizations. It said he loved horses, and that if there was ever a teamster that abused a horse, they would be sent packing immediately. So this is their son, Dick Shire, and we'll see more about him later in the program and how he filled in to work for the Boniface family. So these pictures here, the next 5 or 6, are family photos. They're not, I know the exact date of them, which is really unusual for logging photos. I mean, usually you get these old photos and they're undated, but I know almost to the day, the exact date of these photos, and they come from a family album that has been handed down for many years. But again, we'll come back to these characters a little later. This is Frank Schreier. I think this is one of the most fascinating pictures I have in the collections. And he was an interesting character in and of himself. He helped with the clerking and did some of the payroll, but a really interesting character as I've learned about him. So this is an iconic mess hall scene. And I just, every time I look at this photo, I can't help but think, obviously it's at the end of a hard day working in the woods. And we all know that washing facilities were limited. And so I just think of all of the sweat and smell, and yet they, had to have that fuel for the next day. And as I said, Boniface always fed his lumberjacks well. It was one way you could recruit people. His wage scale for this period would have been $1 a day, and he deducted 50 cents for room and board. But a lot of times lumberjacks would come through and you always gave them one meal, and they would stay because the food was relatively good, and it was one way you retained your employees. Neat little scene in the kitchen here with the chore boy and the cookies, drying the silverware. Those folks worked hard too. They got up really early to get breakfast ready so that people were on the road and out in the woods in time. So as they moved west, they was more rail logging because they made the transition from pine to hardwood. And so they put rail spurs in. The Boniface family did pay for this rail spur to Boniface, Michigan from the main line, which was right around Highway 2. They worked with the Chicago Northwestern to put the line in, but that was part of the investment in building the mill at Boniface, Michigan. And of course, this is a jammer, which is a log loader. There's in the car back here, there's a steam engine and a hoist that lifts the logs up and puts it on the train. So they were starting to use steam engines to aid the operation of logging. These jammers also, the tripod thing there was also a way to operate those with horsepower. But again, once they started using rail, they again moved to this type of operation. This is lunch in the woods. Lunch was brought out, hot lunch was brought out. Again, it's one of the ways if you treated your lumberjacks good and they had a nice warm wheel, they were worked longer and you got a bigger buck for your dollar. So he invested in food all the time. It was part of the fuel. Little side note here, you see this guy here standing with the rifle. They were what my dad called dandies from Detroit, and they'd come up hunting here at the lumber camps, and they called themselves the Nimrods. So anybody who knows anything about Watersmeet, Michigan, it's the name of their mascot for their high school. It's the Nimrods, and it means, it's a biblical reference. That means, I think, great hunter is the way I've heard it explained. I don't know this for a fact, but I was always told this little corner of people here were, again, Ojibwa people that often worked in the camps. So just a little side note. So this is the Boniface Company ledger that I found at Northern Michigan University in Marquette. And it ranged from 1916 to 1926, mainly focused on this Boniface, Michigan mill, which for that period was the main mill in the area. So you see this heading in this book here. It says, if you can't read it, it says Kimberly Clark purchase account. And at that time, Kimberly Clark, a paper mill in the Fox Valley of Wisconsin, was a tightly held family corporation. And the founders of the organization had started to die off. And so stock was slipping out. And so Boniface was trying to, I think it was more or less a hostile takeover. He was trying to gain control of the company because he knew it would be markets for his softwood that was intermixed with the hardwood. So mainly they were shipping down spruce and balsam and hemlock to the paper mills. So we'll take a look at the next slide here. So this is the balance of the account in 1926 after the logging season. And I'll just read it off here, $2,274,103.03. So you can see he was making a serious bid to get control of the Kimberly Clark Corporation. More about that later. So in the 1920s, he had a competitor in Henry Ford, who came to the UP, and he operated hardwood mills. A lot of automobiles were made with wood. So of course, Henry Ford wanted to control his supply chain from beginning to end. He came to the UP. He paid his jacks $1.50 an hour. So, 50 cents more. He didn't deduct 50 cents for room and board. And probably the biggest thing, he provided washing facilities and a mattress. Most lumberjacks slept on what's called a straw tick. So it was straw, and it was often infested with lice, and it was not a very pleasant experience. So Henry Ford upped his game. And so that was a bit of competition there. So in 1924, it's, as the note says here, Boniface constructed this lodge on Lake Dogebik, and we're going to take a look at that in a minute as soon as we introduce this person here, Mary Hogan. She was in the photograph in the parlor in Garden, Michigan. And I suppose most people would have referred to her as the secretary for the organization. She was the gatekeeper for getting to Bill Boniface. And, but I think she was far more than a bookkeeper or a gatekeeper. In today's terms, most people would call her a chief financial officer. She really ran the financial end of the organization, in part because, again, Boniface was illiterate. And my grandmother, here on the right, had gotten married and started having children. And of course, in that day and age, having children and working were not, didn't go together. So Mary Hogan was an important person in the organization and stayed that way for the entire time. And again, still living with the family. So this is the hunting lodge on Lake Dogebik, kind of iconic place, a mile of frontage on Lake Dogebik. It's still there today. And I got a tour of it. This is walking up to the back door of the place. And it's a beautiful place there on Lake Dogebik. Operated now by the Funk family. They're a seed corn magnate. It's more or less just a private retreat. Here's an air photo of it. Nice little trout pond back here. There's a boathouse with wooden, of course, hardwood crisscross boat in it. Really a neat place. There's the front porch where they would have had cocktails and watched the scene unfold in front of them on Lake Dogebik. And this is the dining hall where Boniface entertained a lot of industrialists who had visited here. Harvey Firestone, the DuPonts, and I have at least one documented instance where Henry Ford himself had visited the Lake Dogebik. If anybody knows the history, Henry Ford used to take field trips across the UP, hunting and fishing. They called it vagabond. And he went with Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and Henry Ford. And they drive their automobiles across the UP and camp. It was more like glamping because they brought all of their staff along and were waited on hand and foot. So this is a carriage. Boniface would have done a lot of business with carriage factories. This is actually a Boniface family carriage. But again, the hardwood in the carriage would have been coming off of his lands in the UP, and he would have done businesses with the hardwood in the carriages. So like I said, this is somewhat speculation. I believe that he tried to do business with Henry Ford, and of course, Henry Ford wanted nothing to do. He wanted to control his supply chain from beginning to end. So with Mary Hogan's help, Boniface provided the startup capital for Fisher Auto Body, which became General Motors. And Boniface was a stockholder, major stockholder in General Motors, again, with Mary Hogan's help, and for the rest of his life. And it was one of his major sources of income. So one of the things Mary did was diversify Boniface investment so that he wasn't just in timber. And so this venture into automobile, but he also went into gas and oil, other things, so that you weren't tied to one industry. So this is back to Kimberly Clark. We just finished General Motors, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Kimberly Clark. So this is Frank Sensenbrenner from the Kimberly Clark Corporation. He was the Mary Hogan of the Kimberly Clark Corporation. He was their chief financial officer. And more or less, once all the Clark and Kimberly families started dying out, he was inheriting a major portion of the Kimberly Clark Corporation. And there was a fair amount of tension between Boniface and Sensenbrenner because, as I said earlier, Boniface was trying to gain control. So in 1927, Kimberly Clark bought the William Boniface Lumber Company from William Boniface for $250,000, which wasn't a lot of money because they bought a whole mill site in Marinesco and a lot of the timberlands. But what Boniface got out of this was he didn't gain control, but he became vice president of Kimberly Clark Corporation. And these two competed throughout the rest of their career together. If you go back and look at the corporate records, they were paid exactly the same amount. And it was because William Boniface had purchased so much stock that he was able to do that. So there was a fair amount of tension. So when Boniface sold the Marinesco mill to Kimberly Clark, he still operated it, but he couldn't bring his entire family into the corporation. I mean, he had 7 brothers and sisters. They all worked in the industry. He was able to bring Isaac Boniface with him and John Bennett, who was Mary Boniface's husband, but the rest of them were pretty much out of work. And so in 1923, Boniface purchased Vilas County Lumber Company, or Boniface Gorman Lumber Company, same thing, at Weiniger, Wisconsin, which is just across the border. Today, we would know it as Presque Isle. And he did this because one thing, Bill Boniface didn't just give you money. He expected you to work for it, but he also had a habit of providing work for all of his extensive family. And so he purchased this mill at Weiniger just so that the rest of his family would have jobs. I'll say back to Kimberly Clark for a little bit. So during this period, they were switching to chemical pulping, and they created this thing called cellulose, which was an intermediary step in creating paper, but it was very, very, very absorbent. And World War I came along, and there was a shortage of dressings, cotton dressings. The supply chain for cotton was totally broken down. There was so much demand for uniforms and other things. And so they didn't have adequate bandages, and they discovered this cellulose cotton was absorbent. And so they started using it in dressings on the battlefield. Well, the nurses that were working there discovered that they made a wonderful sanitary napkin, and that's how Kimberly Clark got started in producing Kotex. So again, this is the mill at Weiniger. It provided jobs for all of these individuals here. My Aunt Kate right here was the postmistress. My Uncle Dick Shire was the mill manager. And this little guy here, he had grown up by the time they purchased the mill, and he worked in the company store. My grandfather ran the billiards hall. Now, it wasn't pool, they actually played English billiards. And he had run a billiards hall in Nama, Michigan, too, that we'll see a picture of. So he continued that, and that was his job there at Weiniger. And of course, my grandmother was raising children. So this is an outside picture of the billiards hall in Weiniger, Wisconsin. They also had ice cream, and upstairs they had a dance hall. It's kind of the party place in town. So I said I was promised you a picture of the billiards hall. Here we go. This is the billiards hall in Nama, Michigan. It looks like a kind of a tough place to hang out to me, but that's the way it was. This would be my great-grandmother here. So this is outside the company store. It looks like it's in the summertime, maybe 4th of July or something like that. One thing you'll note is they did have power. The mill yeah, operated a little steam plant where they generated electricity to run the saws, and they provided electricity to the town, but the power was cut off at 9 p.m. every night. So the story goes anyway. The inside of the company store in Weiniger, Wisconsin, the usual materials. Here, I didn't get a picture in, but I do have some of the coins. Of course, they were paid in company script. Bob Walkner, who's a member of the association, kindly just mailed me a coin that I was missing. They were little aluminum coins. Maybe I'll get one here in a minute and show you, but and of course it was script. You got paid in that, and then you could buy things from the company store, but it wasn't much good outside of Weiniger, Wisconsin. You had to spend it here in the store. So I don't know this, but I think this guy hiding behind the box here appears to me to be Dick Shire Jr. Don't know that for sure. These are not family photos. They're off of a historical site. So really interesting here inside of the, a lot of stuff that necessities that people would have purchased with their script from the company. This is the Boniface store in Marinesco, Michigan. I know that we've got a few Marinesco fans on the webinar tonight. Obviously caught fire. Fire was a hazardous thing. A lot of the buildings were heated with wood stoves, and so it was quite common. And this would have been a big loss. This is sometime in the 1920s because of the inventory that would have been lost in the store. It would have been a big, huge loss. Again, the post office was often in the company's store. In Weiniger, the post office was actually attached to the doctor's office. Again, Boniface felt important that they have a doctor on site, at least at the mill site, and provided medical care. There's lots of lawsuits over the years against the company for people that lost a limb and stuff like that, and he generally fought pretty hard on those lawsuits. There was no workers' comp, there was nothing, so it was often a widow or a family that was really struggling because someone had lost a limb or something, and he generally fought back pretty hard on those lawsuits. So that's my Aunt Kate. She would have been the post office postmistress there for about 15 years. Again, Marinesco Plant. This was the one that was owned by Kimberly Clark Corporation. The Marinesco Plant and the Weiniger Plant or Presque Isle Plant were only 20 miles apart. So they shared staff and a lot of materials and supplies, but they were two separate corporations. And again, the one Boniface started just so that he could employ his family members. And again, this is mostly hardwood. They would have been shipping the softwoods, the spruce, balsam, hemlock, down to the Fox Valley or over to Niagara for making into paper. During this period, that, like I think I mentioned before, they were switching from groundwood, pulpwood to chemical processing of the pulp. So that meant they could use harder and harder woods. So they probably were using some of the second growth timber that was coming in to ship down. But the hardwood operation was always important to the organization. It was a major portion of that income. So 332 million board feet of lumber came out of Marinesco. This is from an article in 1955, so it's over a 25-year period. But they sawed a lot of wood there. And again, a lot of that went into motor vehicles, furniture, would have not been for the paper industry. Vilas County Lumber, or the operation at Weiniger, I've never seen this anywhere else. If anybody else has seen a car camp somewhere, I'd be interested. It was an innovation, I think, that was unique to them, but I don't know that. So this was a logging camp on wheels. Essentially, they had a cook shack, mess hall, bunkhouses. They, I think, put up a lean-to for the horses when they got there, but the rest of it was a logging camp on wheels. This shows the mess hall inside of the train car. And I found one in Presque Isle when the company moved out in the 1930s. They sold everything and someone bought one. And I think they're using it like a she shack or something, but it's a kind of interesting to have found this artifact. Again, it would have been made out of hardwood, so it's stood the test of time. This is the train station at Weiniger. There weren't originally, until probably sometime in the 30s, there were no roads to Weiniger. The rail spur came out of Mercer, and the rail line that went up to the Ironwood. And so it was a spur off of Mercer that went through Winchester and onto Weiniger, and dead ended at Weiniger. Back over here, there would have been a turnstile to turn the engine around and send it back to Mercer. That was the main way of getting the lumber out once it was sawed. So this is unloading lumber into the hot pond right here, which helped with the debarking process. And you can see the engine here had pushed this load of lumber up, and then they have this, again, a steam hoist to lift the large hardwood off into the what they call the hot pond. This is the mill at Weiniger. This was a huge mill. Been similar to the Connor mills or some of those other large hardwood mills in Wisconsin. Did a lot of board feed. Over the years, they've manufactured different things. A lot of automobile wood went out, doors and sashes. They almost always had a shingle mill because that's where you put a lot of your waste wood. A lath mill. So they would have done different things over the years, but mostly it was Weiniger started as a furniture manufacturer, bought it, and Mr. Weiniger from Mr. Foster, and then pass it on to Boniface. So I think a fair amount of the hardwood went into furniture also. Again, the hot pond and the mill. This is what they called the burner, where they burnt a lot of the waste wood and would have helped generate steam and power to run the mill. So this is on the top there is a picture of their wood drying yard. It was huge. I've got some aerial photos of it, and it was just huge. No kiln drying here. This is all outdoor in the nature drying. And below it is the most incredible census I've ever seen taken in a lumber camp. Now, when the census taker was in Weiniger itself, all of the jobs were there were a lot of pilers, wood pilers, so that there were young men that were piling this wood up to dry, and it was just person after person after person. But one of the reasons I included this here is I just wanted to run down this census at a lumber camp. So you can see foreman, bookkeeper, section man, second cook, 2 cookies, a barn boss. I'm having trouble reading some of these. Sawyer, of course, teamsters, a hooker and jammer. So the guy that ran the jammer, log loader. He would have helped with loading. And then down here on the bottom, I found this one, a hoist engineer. So these hoists, both on the one you saw at the hot pond and the one you saw in the rail car, had their own engineer. And of course, we think of an engineer as like a road engineer, but an engineer then was someone who operated the steam engine. So this hoist engineer would have been in charge for maintaining all of those steam hoists. Back to Boniface, Michigan. Once it had seen its better days, the Depression had come and it was turned into a CCC camp. Operated for many years during the Depression. Two of my uncles went here because of the Depression. So it's just kind of an interesting second use. Today, there's nothing left of the operation. It's completely gone. And it's private land. Most of it around here is Forest Service land. And Boniface, when he was operating up there, fought the first couple of condemnations the Forest Service did to get land. You know, they went through and condemned land until he realized he could sell this land to the Forest Service, the cutover land, to the Forest Service and recoup his costs. And you know, I saw some documentation that he was tripling his investment in the land he had made. So he took the timber off and then sold it to the Forest Service at a great profit. There's I don't know what to call it, more or less a rumor that Boniface was very frugal, and he could be. I've read his family papers, and he'd often complain about, you know, paying farm workers to work on a rainy day. Well, he could also spend money, and these are just three of his homes. This is in Escanaba. He had two homes. Not at one time, but he had first bought this home on Miami Beach, and then sold that and kind of downsized to this place. This place is slated to be demolished this winter, and I'm trying to get there before it's gone. This place is a gated community. I don't know that I'll be able to get into it, but it sold for 18 million a couple of years ago. And of course, this is Boniface Lodge. So he could spend money as well as save money. Again, Mary Hogan was the brains behind the operation in terms of investing the money that he made. It was quite the partnership they had. And as far as I can tell, the family lived together, you know, quite nicely. Just the three of them. They had no children. And so that brings us to what I promised I would talk about, is what happened to the 25 million, which was probably more like 15 million or 50 million, something like that. Once you included all of the mills, land, all the rest of the appurtenances of the corporations. So Catherine, first of all, half of the estate was given away starting in about 1925. Catherine and William Boniface started to give money to charities, mainly the Diocese of La Crosse received millions of dollars. Marquette University in Milwaukee, which is a Catholic university, Notre Dame University received nice checks from the Boniface family, as did St. Norbert's in Green Bay. So they had started giving away money because they could see they just had too much. So Catherine Boniface inherited 25% of the estate, and this is his wife, Catherine. Isaac Boniface, his main partner throughout the whole period, received 25% of the estate. Mary Hogan received 25%, and then 25% of the rest of the estate was divided amongst a large family. and including my dad did receive a small inheritance from this, but it took until 1948. They didn't, Catherine Boniface lived until 46 or 47, and the estate was not to be distributed until her death. And when she died, like I said, they distributed the rest. My dad's cousin, John Boniface Bennett, was the executor, and I saw in the family papers where he was just selling hundreds and hundreds of shares of General Motors and Kimberly Car Corporation stock, again in 1948. The inheritance had grown, of course, too, because Mary Hogan continued to manage it until her death in 46, I think. So then Catherine Boniface, when she died, left uncharacteristically left a lot of money. The remainder of her inheritance went to public schools in Escanaba. She still had some Catholic charities that she gave to, but she funded, there's still a scholarship that's given out there from invested money that she left, and they still give out, I forget, maybe a $5,000 scholarship every year. So that's what happened to the money. Most of it went to charity. I always say I got like a college education out of the deal. So I'm going to introduce you to a movie called Come and Get It. Maybe some of you have seen it, maybe some of you haven't. Edna Ferber is a Wisconsin author, and she came to Marinesco and to Boniface Lodge, and she wanted to do a book about logging. If you're familiar with her writing, she wrote Cimarron and Showboat. She's a prolific writer, kind of hard luck stories, I would say. So she wrote this movie called Come and Get It. And she did her research at Boniface lumber camps. So she went and went to the lumber camps, and I can see some of the characters, even some of the family members come out in here. I can see Mary Hogan in here. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting. And if I'm able, we're just going to watch a quick clip of the movie, if I can handle the technological change here. Hold on. Maybe Don, while I'm goofing around here, you can ask a question.
Well, first off, Tom, I want to say that was really a fascinating talk. I'm glad you gave this for us tonight. We do have a couple questions. First one, Sam from Minneapolis asked a question about the Ojibwa Jacks. He wondered if there was any documentation of the Ojibwa at the Boniface camps, and whether they were full-blooded or Métis, and where they were housed and fed. Was it with the rest of the Jacks, or was it different?
Yeah, I don't have that kind of detail, and you know, I'll be honest with you, it's been handed down from family members, so you know, it's not, I don't have that kind of documentation. I do know that when my grandfather was widowed, when he lived in Nama, Michigan, he had young children who were still nursing, and they lived on the edge of the Ojibwa community, and he got a wet nurse from the Ojibwa tribe, and that person lived with them for a few years till he remarried. So I know that they had close connection. And at Garden, Michigan, there was the Lac Vieux des Airs band. The Ojibwa people was right there, not at Garden, at Boniface, Michigan, at Waters Mead is the Lac Vieux des Airs band. So like I said, they had a close relationship.
Okay, the second question had to do with the billiard hall in Nama or Nama. Is there another similar named town? First question. And then in the Upper Peninsula, they mentioned that they pronounce it with a long A, not a soft vowel sound. So I'm assuming it would come out Nama rather than Nama.
It is Nama.
It is Nama?
And I know better. Sorry about that.
And then Nama was a company-owned town owned by Badenoch Lumber Company. Was the billiard hall run by your grandparent included in the community club? And then Joan says that her dad was born in Nama.
Correct. So the billiard hall was in the barber shop. And my great-grandfather was the barber, and he died. And when he died, they made it into the billiard hall. So it was not in the community club, it was in the former barber shop.
Okay, now I see you have your video ready to run. Do you want to go through the questions, or do you want to?
Let's show the video. It might just
Okay.
be interesting. Oh, you know, I got to do one thing. I forgot to, sorry about this. This will just take a second. Share with sound.
A cry of warning, and down crashes another giant of the forest. Danger lurks at every turn in this rough and thundering land of tall timber, which only the tough and skillful can conquer, for an unguarded moment means death. But once the hazardous task is done, nothing and no one is safe from the pent-up emotions unleashed by the riotous lumberjacks, who wield their fists as powerfully as their axes. All the drama, lusty humor, the lumber camps. Starring Edward Arnold, the lustiest timber wolf of them all. Ruthless in his fight for wealth, power, and a long-thwarted desire.
Mama, how would you like to go to Chicago to work?
I'd be scared to be in Chicago alone.
No, I'd be there. You'd like that, wouldn't you?
You being a married man and all. People think it was funny.
Joel McCrae and Francis Farmer, inflamed in a love more dangerous than the reckless life that ignited it.
I'm going to New York to live, and you're coming with me.
Now, wait a minute. Come on and fight. Because I'm going to lick the everlasting daylights out of you.
So it's really an
Hello, Discover Card here to explain our cashback match.
Hold
We
on.
match all of the cashback you earn at the end of your first year automatically. It's that simple. Discover, exceptionally.
There we go. Sorry about that. It's really an interesting movie. And like I said, you know, I can recognize the character, you know, that Walter Brennan looks just like the Frank Schreier picture I showed you. I mean, almost identical. So Mary Hogan is in there. Parts of Barney, Glasgow are based on William Boniface, I think. It's just kind of an interesting movie. The full movie is available on YouTube. Just Google it. It's called Come and Get It. All right, onward with the questions.
Okay. Another question had to do, or maybe this was just more a comment. Joan mentions the Catherine Boniface Elementary School was in Garden, Michigan, and most of the children in Garden attended this school beginning about 1953.
Correct. She built several schools, one in Garden. She built Technical College, Badenoch Technical College. She provided the funds for that. She was quite the philanthropist. And of course, they had no children and they had plenty of money to give to other family members. So they just were benefactors to the community. And like I said, they made a big switch from donating to Catholic charities to public schools, which I thought was really nice.
When you first started talking, you mentioned the lumber camps in the Garden area. And they were, once they bought the mills, they were producing lumber. What did they do with it? Who was their market for the lumber? Where did it get sold?
Well, this would have been mostly pine and cedar. So it was during the pine area. So the little harbor shipped their lumber down to Milwaukee and Chicago. The rest would have gone out on rail. I think a lot of the lumber, though, was shipped because they had ports and they had steamships that went down to Milwaukee and Chicago.
Okay. Jim Peterson asked a question about, did Boniface have lumber camps at Weiniger?
He did. They were mainly those car camps that I talked about, although they would have had traditional lumber camps too. But remember, this is the hardwood era. You can't drive hardwood on rivers. You have to get it out on rail. And so they did a lot of rail camping. They would have used horses to get the large hardwood logs to the rail spurs. So they still used a fair amount of horse logging, but they couldn't do the river drives.
Okay, and then Karen from Phillips mentions that Neelan McClurg had a camp on wheels there out in the town of Emery. And I remember John Berg talking about that once before also. And then Joan commented, and this is to everyone, that this presentation is amazing. And I want to echo that. It was an excellent presentation. Your research is so thorough. Thanks for putting the program together. And I will just echo one more time. Thank you for putting this together. It was a very good presentation.
It was fun.
Okay.
Of course, I don't quite know what I'm doing here. I think I'm probably going to write a family history or book of some sort. But every time I think I've got enough information, I find more information. So I really just recently connected with the family of Mary Hogan. And so we're sharing information. And so I'm getting more and more things to add to my little story.
Okay, excellent. Again, thank you, Tom. It was a very good presentation. Just a kind of a plug for next month. Next month, Dale Heikkinen is going to be talking about the Leo Heikkinen machine shop and the Prentice hydraulic knuckle boom loader history. And in the following month, in April, Jerry Apps is going to be talking about when the white pine was king. So we've got two interesting presentations coming up in the next month and next 2 months, and I hope that everyone will join us then. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night.